we'll start with this. Well, Hannah Gabriels versus Marta Gaytan for the WBA light heavyweight title on April 17th. Hannah Gabriels will face Martha Lara Gaytan for the vacant WBA light heavyweight world title. The bout will take place on April 17th at the Fiesta Casino in San Jose, Costa Rica. Gabriels is one of the great female champions of the Pioneer organization and holds the regular super welterweight belt. In addition to having been a champion in the past and fought for the middleweight title in losing effort against Claressa Shields, she dropped Shields in the first round, but lost a lopsided decision over 10. For the Costa Rican, it will be the first fight since 2019. Her inactivity was caused due to an arm injury and later due to the pandemic, but she is now ready to return and prove that she is still one of the best fighters in the world today. What do I think about this story? What do I think about this move? Hannah Gabriels really is one of the better fighters at or around these weights. From 154, 160, 168, and 175, the talent pool is spread pretty thin, and it's nobody's fault. It's just the state of the division. It's just the state of the sport. Not that many girls campaign at those weights. There are fights for Hannah all over the place. There are fights for Hannah at 168, fights at 160, fights at 154. So why the move upstairs? Why the move to light heavyweight where her talents would be squandered in a barren division?
Shields being promoted to super champion at junior middleweight might have something to do with it.
Up until recently, Hannah Gabriels was the only full-fledged WBA champion at 154 pounds. Up until recently, she was their only titleist. But the WBA made a decision to make a super title available for Claressa Shields, a vacant super title, in her fight with Marie-Eve Dicaire. A very dubious move, because if anybody should have been elevated to super champion at 154, it should have been Hannah. The article detailed how Hannah Gabriels locked horns with Claressa Shields at middleweight and suffered a defeat there, but ideally that should not have affected her status as a full-fledged world champion at junior middleweight, not if the fight with Claressa took place at middleweight. Better still, the WBA decided to make a super title available for the Shields versus Dicaire fight, thereby demoting Hannah Gabriels to a secondary titleist, a secondary champion. I wonder if this didn't have anything to do with the move, if this didn't influence Hannah's decision to fight for a light heavyweight title.
I mean, it might have.
It looks to me like a situation where Hannah was forced to campaign as a light heavyweight because all the other world titles are tied up. You got to think about it. Currently, Jessica McCaskill, who was in action not that long ago, is in possession of all the welterweight titles. I don't know that Rick and Jessica would give Hannah the time of day, if I'm being honest. They've got bigger fish to fry. That's one issue, and yet another issue is I don't know that Hannah can make welterweight. I don't know that she can cut down to 147 pounds. No opportunities for at the time being at 147. Claressa Shields is in possession of all the titles at 154, but Claressa Shields doesn't look to be giving Hannah a rematch anytime soon. What's in the immediate future for Claressa is a move to mixed martial arts. No telling when she'll come back to the world of boxing. Opportunities there for Hannah either. The situation isn't all that different at 160 pounds. At 160 pounds, Claressa Shields is in possession of 3 of the 4 Alphabet titles and the Ring Magazine belt, with Savannah Marshall holding the WBO title. We already addressed what's going on with Claressa. I don't think that Hannah would take on someone like Savannah Marshall off this kind of a layoff, having not fought since 2019. I think there's an opportunity there for Hannah, just not straight away. I think that Hannah needs a tune-up fight, and maybe that's why she's deciding to campaign in this barren weight class, in this barren division, for a vacant WBA title. Think of it as a tune-up fight with a title involved. I mean, that's the scope and that's the spectrum. That's the lens I view this move in. That even if Hannah Gabriels wins that WBA title against Marta Gaytan, I don't think she's going to stay up there.
Why would she?
There's no money being poured into women's light heavyweight division. There are barely any opponents, thus barely any fights. I don't imagine that if Hannah wins this fight and wins this title, she's going to campaign as a light heavyweight throughout moving forward. I imagine that she would inexorably make a move back downstairs, maybe to 160, maybe to 154. It's not that there aren't fights for Hana at 160 or 154. It's just that they're not the kind of fights you have when you've been out of action since 2019 and you're coming off an injury. You know, you don't fight a Savannah Marshall, you don't fight a Raquel Miller, you don't fight those kinds of people off that kind of a layoff in that kind of a situation. The silver lining here is that this move upstairs to 175 will afford Hana the opportunity to become a two-division champion. She's already held world titles at 154, and if she is successful in this endeavor, she will have held at least one at 175. So I don't read too much into this move. I have no doubts that whatever happens, Hana is going to descend to the lower weights after this is over, and I'm just glad that she's returning to the ring. Look for this in April.
In other news,
Well, the rumor mill is spinning, and apparently Manny Pacquiao versus Terence Crawford is in talks for June 5th in Abu Dhabi. Top Rank previously attempted to stage the bout in Bahrain last year. It's not a unification match anymore, but Terence Crawford versus Manny Pacquiao remains in play. The Athletic reports that Top Rank has informed its network partner, ESPN, and pay-per-view distributor In Demand to hold June 5th for the potential fight, which is contingent on it taking place in Abu Dhabi. There's no agreement for the fight at this time, and this wouldn't be the first time that Top Rank tried to pit Bud against Pac-Man. They were in quote-unquote serious talks to stage the bout in Bahrain last year, but nothing ever came of that. Pacquiao, who hasn't fought since a July 2019 decision over Keith Thurman and was recently named a champion in recess by the WBA due to inactivity, stated in January that he'd faced Crawford for $40 million and had been linked to a Mikey Garcia fight. Hypothetically speaking, if everything that needs to fall into place does fall into place, and the fight between Terence and Manny were to take place in June, early June, that would be just 1 month short of 2 years of inactivity for the aging Manny Pacquiao.
2 years.
He's going to fight Terence Crawford under these circumstances. I find that a little bit hard to believe.
I do.
Listen, folks.
Ambivalent.
I don't really know how to interpret this news. I've mixed feelings in reference to it because we've heard this kind of stuff before. The article in it of itself cites the previous set of talks from last year in reference to the fight potentially taking place in Bahrain, whereas this year, now they're talking about Abu Dhabi, though it all sounds the same to me. What's supposed to be the encouraging part of this news? Is this set of talks for a fight in Abu Dhabi further along than those talks from last year were about a fight in Bahrain?
Is there more progress this year than there was last year?
And if there is, what's different? What changed? What could have happened from last year till this year that would have made this fight likelier to happen than not? I can think of one or two things. I mean,
I can't.
Manny Pacquiao's name was attached to a lot of different guys. In many ways, it still is.
Yeah.
But last year, it was speculated that Manny could be fighting Mikey Garcia. He could be fighting Conor McGregor. Could be fighting Terence Crawford. Last year, out of that pool of options, I figured the two more likely guys to face Manny would have to be either Mikey Garcia or Conor McGregor.
That's right.
Conor McGregor especially because we all know how much money can be generated when two respective titans of their respective industries come together for a crossover fight.
That was last year.
You fast forward, Conor gets his fucking ass kicked in a rematch with Dustin Poirier.
That fucked that money up.
Watching Conor McGregor get slapped around like that
And knocked out.
in the octagon, in his own element, likely sapped any interest that a Manny Pacquiao crossover fight would have garnered. Thus, that threw a monkey wrench in those plans for Manny.
And that's what changed.
But if the question is what could have happened from last year till this year that would have made Terence Crawford a more attractive option for Manny Pacquiao than what else is out there for him, well, that's one thing. That's one thing that happened. Conor got his ass kicked, and he stood to make more money with Conor than anyone else. Now that he doesn't have that option anymore, he's probably shopping around.
Couldn't he make the same money fighting Mikey that he'd make fighting Crawford?
And that's the thing. I think that Manny Pacquiao could make himself a nice chunk of change fighting Mikey Garcia here in the United States on a domestic pay-per-view. I think he could, but I don't know that he'd walk away from that fight with $40 million. No, I mean, raw numbers, just raw numbers, raw figures. In order to generate $40 million off a pay-per-view here stateside with a price point of $80, you'd have to sell 500,000 pay-per-view buys to generate that. Now, that's not counting in expenses and the break-even point, all that jazz. You'd actually have to sell well in excess of 500,000 pay-per-view buys to give Manny Pacquiao $40 million, pay Mikey Garcia whatever his purse is, and overall, for the pay-per-view to be a success, it would have to sell well in excess of 500,000 pay-per-view buys. And I'm not sure that the fight fans here in the United States are that interested in seeing Mikey Garcia versus Manny Pacquiao. I think the pay-per-view could do some good business, but I don't know that it does
That good.
You'd have to sell 500,000 pay-per-view buys, a minimum of 500,000 pay-per-view buys, just to pay Manny, just to get him that $40 million. Then there's Mikey Garcia's purse to consider, and everybody else fighting on the card, the expenses, the advertising, the promotion.
That stuff.
These promoters, these distributors, these networks, they're not in the business of staging pay-per-views for the sake of staging pay-per-views. They want to turn over a profit as well. I mean, in order to justify that kind of spending, the pay-per-view would likely have to do something closer to 1 million pay-per-view buys for Manny to walk away with $40 million, for Mikey to get whatever he's supposed to be getting or would have got, and for it to be a success overall. The pay-per-view would likely have to sell something closer to 1 million pay-per-view buys to clear those kinds of demands, those kinds of expenses, and for there to be a profit. And I don't know that the fight fans here in America are that interested in Pacquiao versus Garcia. Not 1 million pay-per-view buys interested.
You get me?
So maybe, just hypothetically speaking, Manny figures, if Bob Arum can get me $40 million, yeah, I'll fight Crawford. Of course, when we crunch the numbers, it's not likely that we get that kind of money fighting Mikey. We can make money fighting Mikey, but not that kind of money.
So if Uncle Bob can get us the 40, we'll do it.
But only if he can get us the 40. I want you guys to understand something. That whole blurb about, there being a big announcement in reference to Terrence Crawford's next opponent, his next fight, what's supposed to be set as a pay-per-view. This shouldn't be interpreted as being that announcement because Bob didn't announce it, Terrence didn't announce it, and Manny didn't announce it. This is essentially something that the rumor mill is spinning. And even if the announcement that everybody was talking about was in reference to a potential Manny Pacquiao fight, a Manny Pacquiao pay-per-view, even if that's what all of that was about, well, the fight's not done yet, is it?
Nope.
And we don't know that this fight here today is anywhere now that it wasn't last year. And last year, the fight got nowhere. So I find it hard to get excited over this.
Because it's not a done deal.
They haven't finalized this thing. And if you look at the full picture, you just take a step back and look at the whole thing. You're telling me that Manny Pacquiao left Top Rank, crossed over to the PBC side of things, played with the idea of a crossover fight with a mixed martial artist, played with the idea of a Mikey Garcia fight. He did all of this just so that he could end up fighting Terrence Crawford anyway? The whole thing wraps itself up just a little bit too neatly for me.
Yeah.
That the people over there in Abu Dhabi would be willing to flip the bill for this fight, in essence, putting the value of it in that neighborhood. I mean, it's not that they don't have the money. They have the money, but having the money doesn't mean that you're just going to fritter it away. Then again, they are big spenders over there with a lot of long cash. I'll tell you the truth, I'm not convinced that the fight comes off based on these rumblings, based on these reports. As far as I'm concerned, those eggs need more bacon. But in the event that they get that bacon and this fight comes off, well, that would be quite the role reversal for Terrence Crawford. I know a lot of you aren't going to like this, but
Well?
I've got Terrence Crawford winning the fight if it takes place. I have Terrence Crawford knocking out Manny Pacquiao. This ain't Booze Hound Spence or Inactive Keith we're talking about.
And this ain't boxing on a budget Broner either.
You ask me what happens when you put Manny Pacquiao,
Who's aging?
close to 2 years removed from the sport, in his early 40s, in the same ring as Terrence Crawford, and what I'm going to tell you is Terrence Crawford, by way of knockout. That's what happens.
I don't know how much credit you want to give him for that.
I don't know that here today beating this version of Manny Pacquiao is the kind of victory you shout from the rooftops about. It's quite clear that Manny Pacquiao is in the twilight stages of his career, and if Terrence Crawford is the fighter that retires him, well, I don't know how much credit boxing community at large will give him for that, but I know what it does do. I know what could come of that. If Terrence Crawford has this fight, wins this fight, which is a bigger fight than any fight that Errol Spence Jr.'s had so far, with a bigger name. If Crawford emerges the victor once the smoke settles, he's the A-side to Errol Spence Jr.
The torch will have effectively been passed.
They tried to pass the torch to Adrian Broner, but he just couldn't let his hands loose, couldn't let his hands free from that shell guard of his while getting punched in the face, nodding like nothing happened.
Grab it.
They tried to pass it to him, they tried to pass it to Keith. Keith dropped the goddamn thing. But if Terrence Crawford ends up locking horns with Manny Pacquiao in Abu Dhabi and he beats Manny Pacquiao, the torch will have effectively been paused, and that would make Terence Crawford the A side to Errol Spence Jr. Or at minimum, that would give him an argument to get 50% of the pot, 50% of the proceeds, assuming that fight still is a talking point. I told you, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if Errol Spence Jr. goes his entire career having not fought Terence Crawford. I haven't changed my stance on that. I'm just saying that for those interested, still interested in that argument, in that conversation, well, that's how the cookie would crumble if this fight comes off. You don't have a fight with Manny fucking Pacquiao in Abu Dhabi worth millions upon millions of dollars so you can return to the United States and bend over for little Errol Spence Jr.
You better wake up.
The question is, can Uncle Bob complete this role reversal for what still is his fighter? Can the tables really turn? Tell you, it really would be an unexpected turn of events, because I told you, I viewed Manny Pacquiao as the least likely guy for Terence Crawford to fight in his very next fight. For Manny Pacquiao, it's highly counterintuitive, and the only saving grace, the only incentive would be the financial incentive for Manny. That if Bob can get him that $40 million, well, that $40 million's likely more than he would have made fighting Mikey Garcia or anyone else. Anyone short of Conor McGregor.
There's more in your eye.
I mean, I really would laugh my fucking ass off, given everything that's happened, if Manny Pacquiao ends up fighting Terence Crawford anyway. And I'm not sold that that's what's going to happen, though it would be funny if it did. And what's the competition doing? Fighting Yordenis Ugas on a domestic United States pay-per-view? Is that what he's supposed to compete with? But I don't want to be accused of gloating prematurely. The fight's not made. It's not official. There's been no big announcement. This is just a blurb. The same kind of blurbs we've been hearing since last year. So that being said, my original stance hasn't changed. I'm going to need to see it to believe it.